Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together every week, not just holiday weeks like Father's Day weeks. And for those who are wondering where our Juneteenth celebration is, they only just voted it in as a national federal holiday, which, as we found, once you've made a 3-day weekend out of something, people generally have about a 5-year window before they forget why they have the 3-day weekend, and it's just a reason to have a barbecue. And I'm just saying that to my friends who wanted the Juneteenth federal holiday. That's what's happened to everyone, including Martin Luther King Jr. Our next guest joins us. They have done some amazing work through Freedom of Information Act requests and use that to unearth a lot of the things that we've been talking about in abstract and reality. We've thrown down ourselves with Dr. Ibram Kendi, sort of the modern founding father of critical race theory and the anti-racist movement, which is really actually racism. And they found documentation of its use in our schools, and it's all online at thefamilyfoundation.org, familyfoundation.org. On this Father's Day weekend, welcome in Victoria Cobb, the president of SAME. Victoria, how are you doing this weekend?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Not at all. So tell us about what you unearthed from the Charlottesville School Division regarding what they're basing their curriculums. And if I've looked at the documents correctly, they go all the way from first grade all the way up through high school.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. We're at the Family Foundation. We're thrilled to have these local grassroots teams. We call them Speak Up. So this is Speak Up Charlottesville, and these are people who are keeping watch on their school boards. And Speak Up Charlottesville, our local folks there, saw in a presentation being done by at their school board meeting. They saw, and it was sort of under the guise of anti-racist, anti-biased social studies curriculum, right? So that's the concept. But they basically saw, wait a second, something doesn't look right. This doesn't seem square with what we believe our kids should be taught. And so on their behalf, we did a Freedom of Information request and said, look, we need to know what's in this curriculum that's being taught. And to your point, it is K through 12. And so we pulled the curriculum, and sure enough, there it is. Most people would term it critical race theory. People need to really be careful to not overuse that term because it's the underlying principles that are the problem, not the term. And so because the term has become hot button, we see that schools are trying to say, well, we're not doing that. But it's the actual underlying concepts, which we can get into if that's helpful for your audience. But it's really disappointing to see that this is the way we're going to teach our kids.
Well, yeah, they've rebranded it everything. As we told people back in August of 2017, you could call the rally Unite the Unicorns. Doesn't make it a bunch of unicorns in the park. Just because they call it something other than critical race theory, it doesn't change the fact that they're out there telling children their value is based on the color of their skin. And I think we tried that 100 years ago, and we fought back pretty hard against that as well, Victoria. And it's based on certain texts, and as you to go to your point, there are textbooks and there are learning materials that are the basis of a lot of this educational, the building blocks of it. Take us into what the groups have found in these curriculum planners.
Yes, I think the most disturbing part for our research and getting the information was to discover that it's actually Southern Poverty Law Center that is providing this curriculum. The curriculum is really their product being given to schools. It's called Learning for Justice. And it is, if you are unfamiliar with the Southern Poverty Law Center, they are the group that, likes to brand everyone who believes in any kind of freedom, specifically, definitely religious freedom, as a hate group. And this idea that they are the ones creating this curriculum, because, again, what they're doing in this curriculum is they're classifying people. You are either the oppressed or the oppressor. And every kid is going to find themselves in one of these groups based on their skin color. And then we go on to look through the entire lens of history only from that view. So we are looking at every incident, every document about from the perspective of how are the oppressed being oppressed by the oppressors. And so essentially that allows these kids to then feel the guilt that would come if you are part of the oppressor group and you look back at your history and you think, wow, how did how did my people, because you've now been put in this bucket. It's terribly divisive, and it just defies so much of what we want to teach our children, and so many parents that we want to teach our children to love everyone, that they are part of one human race, that we shouldn't divide into pieces, that we should actually unite and look at history that way.
And that's the part that troubles me the most, is that it is in many ways some of the most racist things I've heard taught to young black children, is that, you're not going to achieve because the white kid exists. And it's almost as if we've gone back 100 years to these racially charged moments. It also says to a kid, regardless of how you behave, you're already either good or bad. You're either the victim or the victor, and I think that's a horrible lesson for kids as well, Victoria.
The whole thing is very black and white, right? So there's there's just everything breaks into two simplified perspectives. So an example of this is really how they look at, during this curriculum, the kids will be asked whether our founding documents, the Constitution, for example, is actually a document that's protecting freedom or protecting slavery. Wow, is that a simplified, disappointing view? Our kids are literally going to have to work through that in their minds, and if you, in fact, might determine that actually our documents do a wonderful job protecting freedoms, but they didn't live that out very well, that might actually be the right conclusion. But that document makes you put it in one bucket or the other, and unfortunately, then the existence of slavery makes you doubt everything good with the founding of our nation.
Well, and it goes back to something that I brought up some time ago, and I try to point people to Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence. It said, if you can find me a more eloquent rebuke over the industry of slavery, I'd love to see it. And people, first told me that was an urban legend. That was a myth. That was right-wing conspiracy theory stuff. Sort of what Terry McAuliffe said about the racial bias being woven into our school curriculums the other day. But that being standing, then when they found it at the Library of Congress of all places, then they said, well, it doesn't matter because it didn't get enacted into law. I said, yeah, but these were not racist people. Your premise is that all our founding fathers were racist, therefore everything the country is built on is racist. And there's an end game to that, Victoria, that I'd like to explore with you some more a little bit. Victoria Cobb on with us from the Family Foundation of Virginia. But their premise being that all these founding fathers were racist is a lie, and it's a provable one as well.
Yeah, what they want to do, again, it's this oversimplification. We want to put everyone in this sort of one perspective, and it's just not accurate. It's not accurate to what we know in their own writings. And what it really is sort of this overall belief that that modern things are good, that we as people who live today are getting towards the good, that we're enlightened, and everything in the past, that is all bad. And actually what we find is that human nature is human nature. There is both good and bad throughout all seasons of life, throughout every decade of our entire history. You will find wonderful things in people. You will find people who have terrible views, and they will be all mixed together and muddied and complicated. And that is how we should teach history, that people are imperfect, but we wrote down some pretty darn perfect ideals. We put some beautiful things in our founding documents, and that is what has made America the amazing country that it has been over these hundreds of years. And so to sort of throw out all the good with the bad is to miss the beauty, and unfortunately it does have terrible ends, because then you raise a generation of children, right? This is a Marxist idea. You raise a generation of children that end up believing that all structures, all institutions are broken, utterly built on evil, and therefore all institutions must be utterly destroyed. That's a Marxist view, and that's where you get to take down the government, take down the police, the nuclear family is bad. All of these things that are actually so important for prosperity and flourishing for our lives.
Victoria Cobb, Family Foundation of Virginia, familyfoundation.org. Look at these blog posts, the FOIA documents from the City of Charlottesville School Curriculum, Southern Poverty Law Center, who, will just randomly go around, throw you on their hate list until you fight back against it for a period of time. Our own organization, the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, was on their hit list. A point I made to one of the gubernatorial candidates, since I brought up Terry McAuliffe earlier, Glenn Youngkin was in deep trouble on my program for allowing the Carlisle group that he ran to allow their employees to contribute to the Southern Poverty Law Center, to which he said that he was fooled by the name. And of course, it's why dark organizations like this pick names like Southern Poverty Law Center. So you don't really see the evilness inside of what they do, and using this to build the curriculum. When they talk about our founding fathers, and then you bring up one of the founding mothers of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, and what they wanted to do to the black family back 100 years ago, they say, well, that's not what Planned Parenthood does now. Yet we see the fruit of their results: broken families, single parent, families in the black community is far greater percentages than they are in the white communities, and the abortion rates outnumber the live birth rates in several of the biggest cities in America, Victoria. Margaret Sanger's vision is the one that's coming true, and I worry that this agenda of critical race theory, racial justice, equal justice, equity, and they've rebranded it so many things in our schools, are designed to teach kids that that's what we should be going for rather than individual liberties.
Well, I so appreciate your Planned Parenthood example, because it is the irony that you point out here, where we have to take down all the structures because at one time there was flawed thinking in some individuals that allowed slavery in this country. And yet in Planned Parenthood, the entire foundational premise of that was eugenics, was this idea that there is better people and there are not so good people, and we want to make sure the not so good people essentially don't procreate. It's a stunning view that it was at the heart of that organization, and yet we're not talking about taking that organization down. In fact, that organization still has in the public fairly decent branding, which is just absolutely remarkable when you compare it to what they have eviscerated some of our founders or some folks during the Civil War, or just folks in our history over. They didn't start entire organizations to destroy human beings because they thought they were less than.
And as you pointed out, Victoria, people can do bad things. At one point, there was a law in Virginia that said if you needed public assistance, the state could sterilize you. A case that went all the way to the Supreme Court and sanctified Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously stated 3 generations of imbeciles were enough to a young black girl from, ironically, Charlottesville, Virginia, Carrie Buck, setting the course and actually saying without, now Supreme Court just says, oh, you don't have standing. But that was back in the day when the Supreme Court would actually take up cases and then rule that it was constitutional for the state of Virginia to sterilize men and women because they needed public assistance.
The interesting thing I find is there's a lot of criticism around our founding because a lot of our founding was based on Judeo-Christian principles. And so you'll hear people, we have to root all of that out. But ironically, it is actually Judeo-Christian principles that value all human life at all stages of life, regardless of their utilitarian purpose in our society, meaning it is actually those principles that say a life is a life from the moment of conception until the moment of their own natural death, and that nothing in our society should say anything less about their value. And yet it's actually when we've gone off of Judeo-Christian principles, we've ended up with situations like the one you just described.
And yet here you go again, taking away this Christian principle that we are all flawed, that we all have the capability of being good or bad, and it's our own effort that will lead us one way or another. And it seems like that's a little bit of this, is to take away the guilt for being bad, and pardon the double point scoreboard, inoculating our kids against feeling guilt for being horrible because, well, you can't help it. You're white and you're just horrible. Or, it's our own actions that create the goodness and the badness. We're all wired with 7 deadly sins, and we have to fight them every day, Victoria.
That is the interesting thing. I mean, really, a right system of justice and a way to look is to handle personal responsibility, that individuals make individual good and bad choices. Yes,
exactly.
Collectively, they can then collectively make a bad decision about something like slavery and a structure. But the thing is, we are moving away from the idea that individuals are responsible for their own beliefs, their own actions. We're putting people into classifications, and then they are either guilty or innocent based on their classification. And in the same way, as you mentioned, we're also looking at entire when we take a group of kids and we say there needs to be equity in their outcomes, that there can't be a child who excels. Charlottesville's an interesting spot. There was an article just yesterday showing up in the news about how now they have 86% of their students eligible for the gifted program.
Yeah.
Well, that's just a little bit ironic to most people because a gifted program is usually intended for a small percentage that actually really are academically God-given and maybe by their own hard work are sort of above others in their ability to speed up the curriculum that they can handle. But now we have 86%, and it's sort of remarked as like this great thing, except that defeats the idea of these kids being able to actually move beyond. So we continue to just destroy individual achievement, individual innocence, individual guilt. Like, we just want to look at things as let's get everybody on an even playing field, but it's to the detriment of so many.
Let me focus on that story because there's an interesting part of that story, Victoria. Very early in it, even the reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, printing in the Charlottesville Daily Progress, a subsidiary minor league paper of the Richmond Times, former Warren Buffett papers, that even the reporter has to admit that this is silly because the state has lowered the standards to allow for more children to fall within this gifted category. And even the reporter can't deny the fact that this is a ridiculous number. If reporters, left-wing, former Berkshire Hathaway reporters are even catching on to this, are we at a place where perhaps the leftists, the statists, the tyrannicals have overplayed their hand? They saw the success with the riots in cities like Richmond, driving the suburban housewife away from Republicans and conservatives, and getting them to vote for Joe Biden because he's not Donald Trump. And other candidates, Mark Warner because he's not Daniel Gade, and we see it in the campaigns. Mark Warner doesn't debate Glenn Youngkin. He debates Donald Trump and says Glenn Youngkin is just Donald Trump. Have they overplayed this, and now all of a sudden suburban housewives are waking up and saying, hold it, you're saying my kid's a racist just because of the color of their skin? How does that work?
Oh, I think they have absolutely overplayed their hand. And we saw it a little bit during the General Assembly. For those who were watching, there is a big showdown about a high school in Northern Virginia that is intended to be an accelerated opportunity for math and science for kids who are accelerated in those areas. And there was a bill that basically would have wiped out that opportunity because, in theory, there are not enough. And originally, sort of those things are usually said there are not enough minorities in that program, except they couldn't even say that in this case because there are more than enough percentage-wise minorities in this case. They just happen to be Asian Americans, not Black Americans. And so that turned into a huge battle. And I will say the dividing lines are falling apart for them. They've tried to, their goal is to divide into two camps and bring everybody over to the left-wing Democratic camp. And what they're doing actually is not just the suburban women who go, wait a second, my child is gifted. I would like them to have the best opportunity. I do expect them to go to a great college and go on to have a very successful career because I want that, that's what I want, and my kid's capable of that. It's not just those moms. It's also the Asian American community is getting left behind in this because it isn't actually about minorities. It's actually about one minority, and so they're kind of questioning. Wait a second, where does that put us in who we ally ourselves with? Because typically they have been a group who has tended to favor merit-based systems because they, in their own communities and cultures, have really focused on achievement and focused on really just hard work.
You mentioned minority, and last segment, last little bit here, Victoria, I want to focus on the real minority in this issue, and that's the minority of the elected officials, the government bureaucrats, the office holders. They're the ones who are the minority, and I think that's why they want to divide us, because the more they divide us, the more we forget that there are way more of us than there are of these little petty, mini Virginia and township tyrants.
Oh, I mean, you were watching this play out in Loudoun County, if you're paying attention to that battle over both CRT and transgenderism, where, I mean, the populace is angry, and they're showing up. I mean, these moms are angry, and these elected officials, the school board, are sitting down. They're so out of touch with their community, and I think that's where we just have to use that as an example to remind everybody in every community across our Commonwealth that they have a voice, that they need to make it heard, that they need to be in the face of these elected officials, because oftentimes they are not representing where our real beliefs are. But the hard part is, for so long, people have been chilled, and their speech has been, it's not, it's socially acceptable to be on the side of, obviously, we want to love everyone. We want to raise up any people who are not exceeding and accelerating and are not respected, but that is not the same as what's being pushed now. And so what's been hard, though, is people have been told, I can't speak up. I can't, because I'll look like I don't actually want the best for all. And so, we have to continuously put forward ideas and programs that say, wait a second, can't we lift others up without taking down the top line? Can't we, if there aren't enough kids that are able to get into these gifted schools from minorities, we should look at that, and we should say, are we offering enough tutoring? Are we helping enough? Not can we dumb down the standards for all so it's meaningless? And that's a challenge. These parents have to speak up and stand up and fight elected officials, get them to understand that they are out of sync, out of touch with the average community member.
Victoria Cobb is the president of the Family Foundation of Virginia, one of the greatest organizations out there. Support everything they do at familyfoundation.org. Victoria, mention to them again about if they don't have a Speak Up branch like the one in Charlottesville, can they start one in their community?
Absolutely. We are getting excited to have these Speak Up teams all across the Commonwealth, and as parents are coming together, they're realizing it's helpful to have an organization behind you, a little bit of resources. We just try to equip people. We don't want to tell Pulaski County how to run their county. We don't want those. We just want to, when those parents speak up and they say, how do we do this? What do we say? What's the right method? Can we do a petition? We just want to be there to help. So yes, we are excited to be just moving grassroots. We were just up in Fairfax County launching Speak Up Fairfax. Goodness knows they need an organized parent group to fight the liberalism there.
Well, thank you again, and find out more at familyfoundation.org. Have a great weekend, Victoria. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Enjoy the rest of your Founding Father's Day weekend. Until next weekend, so long, and thanks for all the fish.